You think you know what loneliness is? Spend 8 years in the New Mexico desert with nothing but the ghosts of your past for company. That was Robert McKenna's life. Every sunrise was a reminder of what he'd lost, and every sunset was a promise of another night spent staring into the darkness, wondering if it would ever end. His ranch, the Sunset Mesa, was his fortress against the world, built with sweat and sorrow on land that didn't want him there. He'd carved out a life from dust and rock, a monument to the wife and daughter he could no longer hold. He was 39 years old, but he felt ancient, worn down by a grief so heavy it was a second shadow. He was riding back from Santa Fe, 3 days of haggling with men who saw him as nothing more than a number in a ledger. The September moon was a cold silver coin in the sky, lighting the trail just enough for a man who knew its every twist and turn. The desert at night is a living thing, full of whispers and unseen movements. But this was different. He felt it before he saw it. A presence. A feeling of being watched that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He reined in his horse, its breath pluming in the chill air, and listened. Nothing. Just the wind and the scuttling of some small creature in the brush. He told himself he was just tired, spooked by his own thoughts. Then he saw it. To his south, about 50 yards out, a shadow was moving parallel to his path. It wasn't a coyote, it wasn't a Mustang. It was too deliberate, too smooth. It moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly human and utterly terrifying. It was keeping pace with his horse, a horse he was pushing hard. No man should be able to move that fast, that quietly, over this kind of terrain. Robert's hand went to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. His heart was a drum against his ribs. The Apache wars were supposed to be over. Geronimo had surrendered. That's what the government men in their clean offices said. But the desert didn't read government papers. He stopped his horse. The shadow stopped too. A silent, terrifying stalemate under the stars. Who was out there? What did they want? Robbery? Revenge? Or something worse? Every instinct screamed at him to spur his horse into a gallop, to ride for the safety of his ranch and not look back. But something held him in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely alone. He made a choice that would unravel his entire world. He raised a hand, not in aggression, but in greeting. "I'm just a rancher heading home," he called out, his voice sounding small in the vast emptiness. "I mean you no harm." For a long moment, there was only silence. The shadow didn't move. It didn't respond. Robert could feel the eyes on him, studying him, weighing his every breath. Was this a warrior? A scout? A ghost? The possibilities churned in his gut like sour milk. He waited, his hand still resting on the stock of his rifle. He knew that in this land, a single wrong move could be your last. He had built his life on caution, on keeping his head down and avoiding trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had come looking for him. The shadow remained perfectly still, a silhouette of a man standing against the pale desert sand. Then the shadow took a step forward, not towards him, but sideways, revealing just a little more of its form. It was tall, lean, and it was holding something long and thin, a rifle. Robert's blood ran cold. This wasn't a chance encounter. This felt like an ambush. He slowly tightened his grip on his own weapon, his mind racing. He could try to shoot first, a risky gamble in the low light. He could turn and run, but his horse was tired, and the man on foot had already proven to be unnaturally fast. It was a trap, and he had walked right into it. The figure took another step, and another, not closing the distance but circling, like a wolf sizing up its prey. What would you do in that situation? Fight or flee? Comment below. I'm curious. Robert held his ground. He had faced down bandits, stampedes, and the kind of crushing grief that would make most men crumble. He wasn't going to be scared off his own land by a shadow in the dark. "If it's a fight you want, you've got one," he said, his voice low and steady, hoping he sounded braver than he felt. The figure stopped its circling, and then it did something Robert never expected. It lowered the rifle, and it spoke. But the voice that carried across the sand wasn't the deep growl of a hardened warrior. It was soft, strained, and it wasn't a man's voice at all. It was a woman. She said something in Apache, her words sharp with a pain that transcended language. And then the moon slipped behind a cloud, plunging the world into absolute darkness. Robert was blind. He couldn't see the figure. He couldn't see the trail. He couldn't even see his own hand in front of his face. All he could hear was the frantic pounding of his own heart and the ragged breathing of his horse. He was completely vulnerable. The perfect time for an attack. He strained his ears, listening for the crunch of a boot on sand, the cocking of a hammer. Nothing. The silence was absolute. Had she vanished? Melted back into the landscape she came from? Was this some kind of trick? Then he heard it. A sound that cut through the night. A sound that changed everything. It was a soft whimper. The sound of someone trying to hold back a sob, but failing. It was the sound of pure, unfiltered agony. Caution be damned. This wasn't a threat. This was someone in desperate need of help. "Are you hurt?" he called out into the blackness. The only answer was another choked sob. Robert swung down from his horse, fumbling in his saddlebag for the small lantern he always carried. His fingers were clumsy, his hands shaking slightly. He struck a match, the sudden flare of light blinding him for a second before the lantern's wick caught, casting a small, fragile circle of yellow in the oppressive dark. He held the lantern high. "I can't see you," he said, his voice softer now. "Let me help." The silence stretched on. He could feel her out there, just beyond the light, wrestling with a choice. Trusting a white man in this territory was a death sentence for her people. He knew that, but he also knew that leaving her out here, injured and alone, was a death sentence too. He stood there, a beacon in the dark, and waited. He was offering a hand to a stranger, a potential enemy, with no idea what it would cost him. He just knew he couldn't turn his back. Not again. Finally, a figure stumbled out of the darkness and into the light, and Robert's breath caught in his throat. It was a young Apache woman, maybe 16 or 17 years old. Her traditional dress was torn and stained with blood, some of it old and brown, some of it terrifyingly fresh. Her face and arms were a tapestry of cuts and bruises, but it was her eyes that hit him the hardest. They were old eyes in a young face, hollowed out by horrors he couldn't even begin to imagine. She was favoring her left leg, and he could see a crude, bloody bandage wrapped around her ankle. She wasn't a warrior. She was a child who had been through hell. "My God," Robert whispered. He took a step toward her, but she flinched back, her body tensing, ready to run despite the obvious pain. He stopped immediately, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. "What happened to you?" he asked gently. She watched him, her gaze sharp and intelligent, searching his face for any sign of deception. For what felt like an eternity, she just stared. Then she seemed to come to a decision. She spoke, her voice raspy, a mixture of Apache and broken English. "Soldiers," she said, and that one word was filled with so much hatred and fear, it made Robert's stomach clench. "They came. They killed." The story came out in shattered pieces. Her small band had been hiding in a remote canyon, trying to live freely, away from the reservations that were little more than prisons. The soldiers had descended at dawn. They claimed they were searching for stolen cattle, but it was a lie, a pretext. There was a confrontation, an argument over a sacred medicine bundle belonging to an elder. The soldiers panicked, or maybe they were never planning on letting anyone live in the first place. They opened fire. "They killed my grandfather," she whispered, her voice cracking. "My uncle, my little brother." They rounded up the survivors, the women and children, to be hauled off to the reservation. But she had run. She had scrambled up the canyon walls, bullets kicking up dust around her feet. They shot her horse out from under her, but she kept going. For 2 days she had been running, with the soldiers on her trail. 2 days. Across the brutal, unforgiving desert, with no food, little water, and an injured leg. Robert looked at this girl, this child, and saw a resilience he could barely comprehend. She had survived, but the ordeal was far from over. The soldiers were still out there, and now he was involved. Helping her was a federal crime, harboring a fugitive. They could throw him in prison, seize his ranch, destroy the one thing he had left in the world. But looking into her haunted eyes, he didn't see a fugitive. He saw a survivor. He saw a reflection of his own loss, his own pain. He saw a human being who had been wronged by a cruel and unjust world. The law didn't matter. The risk didn't matter. All that mattered was the frightened, wounded girl standing in front of him. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice soft. "Ayana," she said. "It means eternal blossom." "I'm Robert McKenna," he replied. "My ranch is a few hours from here. You can be safe there. Rest, heal." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You help Apache?" she asked, her voice filled with suspicion. "Soldiers say all white men want us dead." "Some do," Robert admitted, his voice grim. "But I'm not one of them. I've lost family too, Ayana. I know what it feels like to have your world ripped away from you." A flicker of understanding passed between them, a shared language of grief that needed no translation. In that moment, they weren't a white man and an Apache girl. They were just two lonely souls in the vast, empty desert, bound by a common tragedy. He was breaking the law, risking everything he had worked for. But as he helped her onto his horse, settling her behind him, he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he was finally doing something right. The ride to the ranch was slow and agonizing. Every jostle of the horse sent a fresh wave of pain through Ayana. She was so weak she could barely hold on, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist. Robert could feel the fever radiating from her skin. She was worse off than he thought. She drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering in her native tongue, her words a fevered litany of names and places he didn't understand. But he understood the terror in her voice. He pushed the horse as fast as he dared, the familiar landscape seeming alien and threatening in the pre-dawn gloom. He felt a desperate urgency, a need to get her to the safety of his home before she faded completely. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky, the silhouette of his ranch came into view. The Sunset Mesa, his sanctuary. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine sense of relief at the sight of it. He wasn't just coming home to an empty house anymore. He was bringing someone with him. He was bringing life back to a place that had been touched by death for too long. He half carried Ayana from the horse to the porch, her weight a fragile burden in his arms. Inside, he laid her down gently on the spare bed, a bed that hadn't been slept in since before his wife Sarah had passed. The irony was not lost on him. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady. He lit the lamps, stoked the fire, and went to work on her wounds. The injury to her ankle was bad, a deep gash that was already showing signs of infection. There were other cuts, bruises, signs of a terrible struggle. As he cleaned and bandaged her wounds, she watched him with those wide, weary eyes. "You have gentle hands," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, "for a man who lives alone." Robert felt a pang in his chest. "My wife, Sarah, she was a teacher," he found himself explaining. "She taught me how to do this. She said everyone on the frontier should know how." "She was a good woman," Ayana said, her gaze drifting to the small, framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was the only picture he had of them. Robert, Sarah, and their baby daughter Mary. A happy family, frozen in time, just months before the cholera epidemic had stolen them from him. "They are beautiful," Ayana said softly. "Your daughter, she has your eyes." Robert's throat tightened. He never spoke about them. The pain was too raw, even after all these years. But with this stranger, this girl from a different world, the words came tumbling out. "She had my eyes, but her mother's smile," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Apache believe," Ayana whispered, her own eyes heavy with sleep, "that children who die young become stars, to guide their parents." The thought was so simple, so beautiful, it took his breath away. He had spent 3 years trying to forget, to bury the pain under hard work and solitude. He had never considered that his little Mary might still be watching over him. Maybe, just maybe, she had guided him here, to this moment, to this girl. As Ayana finally succumbed to an exhausted sleep, Robert sat by the fire, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. His world had been turned upside down in less than a night. He had a fugitive sleeping in his guest room, a girl who was a witness to a military atrocity. The soldiers who were hunting her would not give up easily. They would be searching the area, asking questions. His lonely, predictable life was over. He was now a criminal, a conspirator. The sensible thing to do would be to give her supplies and send her on her way as soon as she was strong enough. Point her toward the Mexican border, wish her luck, and wash his hands of the whole affair. It was the safe choice, the logical choice. But as he looked at the peaceful expression on her sleeping face, he knew he couldn't do it. His house no longer felt empty. The silence was no longer a comfort. It was a void that he now realized she had filled. For the first time in 3 years, he felt something other than grief. He felt purpose, and that scared him more than any cavalry patrol. He walked out onto his porch, watching the sun climb higher, painting the red rock formations in hues of orange and gold. And that's when he heard it, the sound he had been dreading, the rhythmic thunder of approaching horses. Fast, purposeful. He looked out and saw a cloud of dust on the horizon. And in that cloud, the glint of sunlight on metal and the dark blue of cavalry uniforms. They were here. Robert's heart hammered against his ribs. 4 riders, an officer in the lead. They weren't just on patrol, they were riding straight for his ranch. There was no time to hide Ayanna, no time to think. He had to face them. He moved to stand in the doorway, his body blocking the view into the house, his expression carefully neutral. He had to play this perfectly. One wrong word, one flicker of fear in his eyes, and they would both be doomed. The lieutenant dismounted, his movements crisp and efficient. He was young, with a hard, serious face that looked like it had never known a smile. "Mr. McKenna," he said, his voice sharp. "I'm Lieutenant Harrison, 2nd Cavalry." "Lieutenant," Robert replied, giving a curt nod. "What can I do for you?" Harrison's eyes swept over the ranch, taking in every detail. He was a man who missed nothing. "We're searching for an Apache fugitive," he said, his gaze locking onto Robert's. "A young woman, escaped from military custody 2 days ago. She's considered dangerous. Have you seen any unusual activity in the area?" The question hung in the air, heavy and loaded. This was it, the moment of truth. Robert could feel Ayanna's presence behind him, could almost hear her holding her breath. He had to lie, and he had to make it believable. "The trail from Santa Fe was quiet, Lieutenant," Robert said, his voice steady. He chose his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. "I saw nothing out of the ordinary." Harrison stared at him, his eyes cold and penetrating. He was trying to read him, to find the lie. "Mr. McKenna," the lieutenant said, his voice dropping, taking on a more menacing tone. "You should know that harboring a fugitive is a federal crime. If you're withholding information, it would be in your best interest to tell me now." It was a threat, plain and simple. Robert felt a surge of anger. Who was this boy in a uniform to come onto his land and threaten him? "I've told you what I saw," Robert said, his own voice hardening, which was nothing. A tense silence stretched between them. The other soldiers sat on their horses, their hands resting on their rifles, their eyes scanning the ranch house. They wanted to search the place. Robert knew it, but they needed his permission, or a damn good reason, and right now they had neither. Finally, Harrison seemed to make a decision. "Very well, Mr. McKenna," he said, though his eyes still glittered with suspicion. "But we'll be patrolling this area. If you see anything, you're to report it immediately." He turned, mounted his horse, and with a final, lingering look, led his men away. Robert watched them until they were just a speck of dust on the horizon. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his body trembling with adrenaline. He had done it. He had faced them down and won. He turned, expecting to see relief on Ayanna's face. But she wasn't in the spare room. She was standing in the kitchen doorway, and she was holding a rifle. His rifle. And it was pointed directly at his chest. "You lied," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "For me." Robert stared at the rifle, then at her face. The look in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It was suspicion. Deep, profound suspicion. "Why?" she asked, her knuckles white on the stock of the gun. "No white man risks his life for an Apache. What do you really want from me?" The accusation hit him like a physical blow. After everything he had just risked, to be met with this? He felt a flash of anger, but it was quickly replaced by a weary understanding. Why should she trust him? Her entire life had taught her that men like him were the enemy. Put the gun down, Ayanna, he said, his voice tired. I want to help you. It's that simple. She didn't move. The rifle remained steady. Nothing is simple, she retorted. The soldiers. They were not looking for just a runaway. The officer, Harrison, he used a word, fugitive, but he also said, stolen property. What did you steal? Robert stared at her. He hadn't even processed that part of the conversation, his mind so focused on the lie. But she was right. Harrison had been specific. What had they accused her of stealing? I stole nothing, she insisted, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Fear? Deceit? My people took nothing. They lied. They're soldiers, Ayanna. They might lie about why they attacked, but they don't usually invent charges of theft without a reason. What aren't you telling me? He pressed, taking a slow step forward. She tensed, the rifle barrel unwavering. Stay back. He saw it then. Tucked into the waistband of her torn dress was a small leather pouch. It was beaded in a way that was too fine for a simple carrying bag. It looked important. What's in the pouch, Ayanna? He asked softly. Her eyes darted down to it for a fraction of a second, and that was all the confirmation he needed. She was hiding something, something the soldiers wanted badly. This was no longer just about helping a refugee. He was caught in the middle of something far more dangerous, and he didn't even know what it was. His simple act of kindness had dragged him into a conspiracy. It is nothing, she said, her voice tight. A gift from my grandfather. Memories. Memories the cavalry is willing to kill for? Robert shot back. I just lied to a federal officer for you. I put my entire life on the line. I think that earns me the right to know what kind of trouble I'm in. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the deep, ingrained instinct to trust no one, warring with the fact that he had, for now, saved her. Slowly, hesitantly, she lowered the rifle. Her hands were shaking. She reached into her dress and pulled out the leather pouch. She didn't open it. She just held it out to him. Robert took the pouch. It was heavier than he expected. The leather was old and supple. He loosened the drawstring and tipped the contents into his palm. It wasn't jewelry or sacred stones. It was a book, a small leather-bound ledger, the kind used by army quartermasters. And tucked inside the front cover was a folded, yellowing map. He opened the ledger. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailing dates, shipments, and payments. It looked like a standard supply log at first, but then he saw the notations, coded entries, names of mining companies, and weights listed in ounces, not pounds. This wasn't a log of flour and blankets. It was a record of gold, illegal gold shipments being moved secretly off the official books. And then he saw the name, signed at the bottom of several pages. Major D. Thorne, the commanding officer of the entire territory. This wasn't just a few rogue soldiers. This was corruption at the highest level. They weren't just clearing out native populations for settlement. They were clearing them out to protect a secret, illegal mining operation. Ayanna's people hadn't been in the way of progress. They had been in the way of profit, and they had been silenced for it. My grandfather, Ayanna said, her voice barely a whisper. He found this on a dead soldier weeks ago. He did not know what it was, only that it was important. He told me to take it, to run, to show it to someone who could bring justice. Justice. The word tasted like ash in Robert's mouth. There was no justice out here. There was only power, and Major Thorne had all of it. This ledger was a death warrant for Ayanna and now for him. Lieutenant Harrison wasn't just hunting a fugitive. He was retrieving evidence for his corrupt commander, and he would stop at nothing to get it back. We have to destroy this, Robert said, his voice urgent. Burn it. Now. It's the only way we'll be safe. Ayanna's eyes flashed with a fire he hadn't seen before. No, she said, her voice ringing with sudden strength. This is the only proof of what they did. It is the only voice my family has left. I will not silence them. Robert looked from the ledger in his hand to the fierce determination on her face. She was right. To destroy it would be to let the murderers win. But to keep it? It was suicide. Harrison's patrol would be back. They knew he was lying. He could see it in the lieutenant's eyes. They would be back, and they would have a warrant, or they wouldn't bother with one at all. They would tear his ranch apart until they found that book. And when they did, they would leave no witnesses. He was trapped. There was no running, no hiding. The only way out was through, and he had a crazy, desperate, impossible idea. An idea that could save them both, or get them killed even faster. "They're coming back for you," Robert said, his mind racing. "And as long as you're just an Apache girl hiding on my land, you have no rights, no protection. They can drag you away, and no one will say a word." "Then what can we do?" she asked, her newfound fire dimming, replaced by the cold shadow of fear. Robert took a deep breath. The words felt strange and foreign on his tongue. "We make it so they can't touch you," he said. "We give you protection under the law. We make you a citizen." Ayanna stared at him, confused. "How?" He looked her straight in the eye. "We get married?" The proposal, if you could even call it that, hung in the air between them. It was insane. A marriage of convenience, a legal fiction to protect a fugitive. Ayanna looked at him as if he had sprouted a second head. "You want to marry me?" she asked, her voice a mix of shock and disbelief. "A girl you met yesterday? An Apache?" "I want to keep you alive, Ayanna," he said, his tone deadly serious. "As my wife, you would be Anna McKenna, a citizen, living on your husband's property. Harrison and his men couldn't touch you without going through the courts. It would buy us time. Time to figure out what to do with this," he said, holding up the ledger. It was a cold, calculated, tactical move. A marriage not of love, but of survival. He was offering her his name as a shield. But as he looked at her, he realized it was more than that. He was offering her a place in his world, a place in his home. He was asking her to tie her fate to his, for better or, more likely, for worse. And he was asking himself to open up his quiet, solitary life to this whirlwind of a woman who had crashed into it. Was he ready for that? He thought of the long, empty years stretching behind him, and the even longer, emptier years that had stretched ahead. Maybe, just maybe, this was the rain his desert heart had been waiting for. Ayanna was silent for a long time, her dark eyes searching his face. She was weighing the offer, seeing the logic, but also seeing the immense personal cost. She would be binding herself to a white man, to a world that had tried to destroy her. But what was the alternative? A life on the run, forever looking over her shoulder? Or capture and a slow, anonymous death on a reservation? "Marriage is more than a paper," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "It is sharing a life, sharing a bed. Are you ready for that, Robert McKenna, with an Apache girl who carries ghosts you cannot see?" The question turned his own logic back on him. Was he? Was he ready to share his life, his home, his grief with her? "Are you ready," he countered, "to share your life with a lonely rancher who talks to his own ghosts?" A small, sad smile touched her lips. It was the first time he had seen her smile, and it transformed her face. "Maybe," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "maybe we are two people who have been alone long enough." And just like that, an agreement was struck. Not with a kiss, but with a solemn nod. A pact made in the shadow of death. They would become husband and wife, a rancher and a fugitive. Two broken people, hoping to make a whole life. They didn't have much time. Robert rode into the nearest town the next morning, a small, dusty settlement with a circuit judge who was more interested in whiskey than legal precedent. He told the judge he was marrying a woman named Anna, a distant cousin of a friend who had recently arrived from the east. He paid the fee, filed the papers, and the judge, smelling the whiskey Robert had brought as a gift, asked no questions. The piece of paper he rode home with felt flimsy, a fragile defense against the storm that was coming. When he showed it to Ayanna, she simply traced the name, Anna McKenna, with her finger. It was the death of one identity and the birth of another. They settled into a strange new reality. They were husband and wife, but they were also strangers, circling each other cautiously in the quiet rooms of the ranch house. They ate their meals in near silence, the unspoken tension a third person at the table. Robert found himself watching her, fascinated by the way she moved, the quiet dignity she carried despite everything she had been through. She learned the rhythms of the ranch quickly, her sharp mind soaking up every detail. She was a survivor, adaptable and resilient, and slowly, piece by piece, the walls between them began to come down. She told him stories of her people, of the beliefs that had sustained her. He, in turn, found himself talking about Sarah and Mary, not with the crushing weight of grief, but with a gentle nostalgia, sharing their memory with someone who understood loss. But the peace was fragile, an illusion. Every time a rider appeared on the horizon, their hearts would leap into their throats. They knew Harrison hadn't given up. He was watching, waiting. The ledger remained hidden, a constant, ticking bomb in their new life. They argued about what to do with it. Robert wanted to find a way to get it to an honest lawman, if such a thing existed. Ayanna was convinced no white man could be trusted, that they should use the information to expose Thorne themselves. The marriage had given them a shield, but it was a shield made of paper, and they both knew it wouldn't hold forever. The breaking point came a week later. Robert was out mending a fence line at the far edge of his property when he found tracks. Not the 4 riders from before, a dozen, maybe more, and they weren't the clean tracks of cavalry horses. They were shoddy, uneven, the kind of horses used by men who didn't care much for their animals. Mercenaries, hired guns. He raced back to the ranch, his heart pounding with a new kind of dread. This wasn't Harrison coming back with a warrant. This was Thorne, tired of waiting, taking matters into his own hands. He burst into the house to find Ayanna staring out the window, her face pale. "They're here," she whispered. He looked past her and saw them, a group of hard-looking men spread out in a loose semicircle at the edge of his property, just beyond rifle range. They weren't wearing uniforms. They were a rough collection of cutthroats and killers, and leading them, sitting tall on a fine black stallion, was a man with a silver mustache and cold, dead eyes. He wore the uniform of a major in the United States Army. It was Thorne. He had come himself. The pretense was over. This wasn't about the law anymore. This was about brute force. Thorne raised a hand, and one of his men trotted forward, a dirty white flag tied to his rifle. They wanted to parley. "Stay here," Robert said to Ayanna, grabbing his rifle. "Bar the door." He walked out onto the porch, his every muscle coiled tight. The rider stopped 100 feet away. "Major Thorne wants the book," the man yelled, his voice rough. "And the girl! Give him up, and he'll let you live." Robert's hands tightened on his rifle. Let him live? After what he now knew, Thorne couldn't afford to leave any witnesses. It was a lie. "This is my property," Robert yelled back. "You've got no authority here. Get off my land." The rider laughed, a nasty, grating sound. "This ain't about authority, rancher. This is about what the major wants. And he wants what you've got." Then Thorne himself rode forward, stopping beside his man. His eyes, even from this distance, were like chips of ice. He looked at Robert, then his gaze shifted to the house, as if he could see Ayanna through the thick adobe walls. He raised his voice, his words carrying with the arrogance of a man used to absolute command. "McKenna, I know who you are. I remember you from Denver, a man with a pretty wife. Sarah, wasn't it? Such a tragedy, that cholera outbreak. So sudden, so convenient." The words hit Robert like a physical punch. Denver. He knew his name. He knew Sarah's name. It wasn't a random comment. It was a message, a threat. And in that moment, a dark, terrible suspicion began to form in the pit of Robert's stomach. The cholera epidemic in Denver had been strange. It had struck suddenly in a specific part of the city, a district that developers backed by military contracts had been trying to buy up for months. The residents, including Robert and Sarah, had refused to sell. Then the sickness came. It was swift and brutal. Officially, it was a public health crisis. But what if it wasn't? What if Thorne's corruption hadn't started here in New Mexico? What if the man who had ordered the massacre of Ayanna's family was the same man responsible for the death of his own? The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that Robert felt his vision swim. "What do you know about Denver?" Robert shouted, his voice hoarse. Thorne just smiled, a cruel, knowing smirk. "Last chance, McKenna. The book and the girl." Robert looked back at the house. He thought of Ayanna, her fierce spirit, her courage. He thought of Sarah and little Mary, their faces smiling at him from the photograph on the mantel. He had lost one family to this man. He would be damned if he was going to lose another. He raised his rifle. Get off my land. Thorne's smile vanished. He gave a curt nod to his men, turned his horse, and rode back to the line. The siege had begun. The first shots rang out just as the sun began to set, turning the sky the color of blood. They weren't trying to storm the house, not yet. They were trying to pin them down, to test their defenses. Bullets thudded into the thick adobe walls, splintering the wooden window frames. Robert and Ayanna were on the floor, rifles in hand, moving from window to window, trying to get a sense of their numbers and positions. There's at least 12 of them, Robert said, his voice grim as he peered through a small crack. They're spread out, using the rocks for cover. They will wait for dark, Ayanna said, her voice calm and steady. She was no longer the frightened girl he had found in the desert. She was a warrior. They will think we are afraid of the night, but the night is my friend. For the first time, Robert felt a flicker of hope. He was a rancher, not a soldier, but he knew this land. He knew every rock, every gully, and Ayanna. She knew how to fight in a way the army never taught. They weren't just two people trapped in a house. They were a team, a partnership forged in fire. We're not going to just wait for them to attack, Robert said, a plan forming in his mind. We're going to bring the fight to them. During a lull in the shooting, as darkness finally fell, Ayanna turned to him. Her face was grim in the flickering lamplight. Before we do this, she said, there is something else you must know. About the ledger. She retrieved the book from its hiding place and opened it to a page near the back. The entries were different here. Shorter, more cryptic. One line was circled in faint pencil. It was a date. The date the sickness had started in Denver. And next to it, a single phrase. Aqua vitae contaminatio. Latin. Robert had learned some from his wife. He sounded it out. Contamination of the water of life. It wasn't cholera, it was poison. Deliberate, calculated mass murder, disguised as an epidemic. All to clear a piece of land, all for profit. The ledger wasn't just proof of gold smuggling. It was proof that Major Thorne had murdered his wife and his baby daughter. The grief that had defined Robert's life for so long was burned away in an instant, replaced by a white-hot, purifying rage. This was no longer about survival. It was about vengeance. He looked at Ayanna, and he saw the same fire reflected in her eyes. Her family, his family. Their ghosts were crying out for justice, and tonight they were going to get it. They didn't wait. Under the cover of a moonless sky, they slipped out the back of the house, melting into the shadows. This was Ayanna's world now. She moved with a silence that was supernatural, a ghost in the darkness. Robert, for all his knowledge of the land, felt clumsy and loud beside her. She taught him how to walk without making a sound, how to use the terrain for cover, how to listen to the language of the night. They circled around Thorne's men, who were camped carelessly, confident that their prey was trapped. They were wrong. The prey was hunting them. They worked as a single unit. Ayanna would create a diversion on one side of the camp, a rock thrown, a sound in the brush, drawing their attention. Then Robert, from the other side, would take one of them out, a silent takedown, a knife in the dark. They were whispers, phantoms. Thorne's men grew jumpy, firing at shadows, their discipline crumbling. They were soldiers of fortune, not warriors. They were motivated by pay, not purpose, and they were terrified. Robert and Ayanna struck again and again, fading back into the darkness before anyone could react. 2 down, then 4. The hunters had become the hunted, but their luck couldn't hold. As they moved into position for another strike, a stray footstep from Robert snapped a dry twig. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. A nervous guard spun around and fired blindly into the dark. The shot went wide, but the muzzle flash illuminated them for a split second. The alarm was raised. Shouts echoed through the camp. Men grabbed their rifles, firing wildly into the night. Robert and Ayanna were exposed, pinned down behind a small cluster of rocks. They were out of time. The rest of Thorne's men were closing in, forming a circle around their position. This is it, Robert breathed, reloading his rifle. If we don't make it, we will, Ayana said, her voice fierce. Our ghosts are watching. They prepared for the final charge, ready to sell their lives dearly. And then a new sound cut through the chaos. A bugle call, clear and sharp in the night air. And behind it, the thunder of a full cavalry charge. Out of the darkness, a line of blue-coated soldiers appeared, riding hard, their carbines flashing. At their head was Lieutenant Harrison. Harrison and his men had been sent on a wild goose chase by Thorne, a patrol to the far side of the territory. But the lieutenant was smart. He had suspected a setup. He'd doubled back, and when he'd heard the gunfire, he'd come to investigate. Now he saw it all. His commanding officer leading a band of illegal mercenaries, laying siege to a civilian's ranch. The pieces clicked into place. The stolen ledger. The fugitive girl. It was a cover-up. Harrison had a choice to make. Follow the orders of a corrupt commander, or uphold the law he had sworn to protect. He chose the law. The fight was short and brutal. Thorne's mercenaries were caught completely by surprise, trapped between Robert and Ayana's rifles and Harrison's charging cavalry. They broke and ran, throwing down their weapons, their will to fight shattered. In the chaos, Robert saw only one man, Major Thorne. The Major, seeing his plan in ruins, was trying to flee, spurring his horse back towards the trail to Santa Fe. But Robert was faster. Fueled by years of repressed rage, he sprinted from behind the rocks, cutting off Thorne's escape. He tackled the Major, dragging him from his horse. They crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs. Robert's hands were around Thorne's throat, his vision clouded by red. All he could see were Sarah's and Mary's faces. All he could hear were Ayana's stories of her murdered family. He was ready to end it, to squeeze the life from this monster with his bare hands. But then he felt a gentle touch on his shoulder. It was Ayana. "No, Robert," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Not like this. Death is too easy for him. Let him face justice. Let the world know what he did." Her words cut through his rage. She was right. Vengeance was for him. Justice was for everyone they had lost. He loosened his grip, hauling Thorne to his feet and shoving him towards Lieutenant Harrison. "Major Thorne," Harrison said, his voice cold as steel, "you are under arrest for murder, theft, and treason." As the soldiers led Thorne away in chains, Robert and Ayana stood together on the porch of their ranch, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. The nightmare was over. The ledger was safe, evidence that would dismantle Thorne's entire corrupt network. Their land was safe. They were safe. Robert looked at Ayana, this incredible woman who had saved him in more ways than one. She was no longer a fugitive, and he was no longer just a lonely rancher. They were survivors. They were partners. They were family. In the years that followed, the Sunset Mesa Ranch became something more than just a piece of land. It became a sanctuary, a place where people, regardless of their skin color or background, could find a fair chance. Robert and Ayana McKenna's story became a quiet legend in the territory. A story of how two people from different worlds, brought together by violence and grief, had built a bridge instead of a wall. They had children of their own, children with Robert's eyes and Ayana's warrior spirit, who grew up hearing the stories of the ghosts who watched over them from the stars. Sometimes late at night, Robert would stand on his porch and look out at the same desert that had once seemed so empty and hostile. He would think back to that fateful night, to the shadow that had moved beside his trail. It had taken a lifetime of loneliness to understand that some encounters are not accidents, but destiny, that some shadows are not threats, but salvation, and that sometimes the greatest love stories don't start with a kiss, but with a promise to stand together against the darkness until the sun comes up. If you were moved by Robert and Ayana's story of courage and justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. You never know what shadows are waiting in the next story. Thanks for listening.